Okay, so thanks again for joining us. And so from last month's meeting, when, sorry, I'm a little nervous. Whew. Okay, last month's meeting, we left the family with Eugenie's ex-husband, Joseph M.B. Putz, and her brother, Louis, mysteriously dying in 1877 with no records located. Jacques and his wife had also died in 1901 and 1905, and George and Eugenie were creating a real estate empire while Frederick and Julia were spending more time in France. Where we will pick up is where we left the nieces and nephews who were growing up as second-generation French pioneers. Frederick had said many times that he wanted his children to know France and have the benefits of being raised both in America and in France. Starting around 1875, Frederick and his family would go back and forth to France and purchase a bunch of wine and luxury items in Denver for his restaurant and future hotel. Henry Charles, his son, would usually join him on these journeys. Also in 1875, Frederick purchased the lots at 333 Tremont, in which he and his family would build their home in Denver. In this image, you could possibly see the view of the home. It looks like it was built in the beautiful French Second Empire style that was prominent at the time and calls back to the ancient past when all things were in vogue during the regime of Louis Napoleon between 1852 and 1870. Even after the Franco-Prussian War ended in 1871, the Second Empire style buildings continued to ride high on a tide of huge, newly minted post-Civil War fortunes that were amply equipped to handle these extravagantly decorative houses. The Second Empire style remained the first choice of wealthy home builders and their architects because it was, in their eyes, not only thoroughly modern, but also fashionably flashy in a way that was a very flashy era indeed. However, today, the street is not even recognizable from what it used to be in this photo, except for the cathedral in the background. In 1890, electricity started making its way through the city. Fred Charpiot, who resided at 14th and Tremont, was one of the 7/8 of the property signers who had sent their prayer to the mayor, hoping to okay an electric line in front of their homes. One of the residents, a very wealthy man who owns a palatial home and newspaper, did not want the electric line in front of his residence, and his newspaper tried to create the impression that all the people of 14th Street do not want the rapid transit system there. It is said by a person most familiar with the men and measures of the city government that the aldermen and supervisors will pass the bill over the mayor's veto. And as we know before, Frederick was fond of progress, and the Charpiot Hotel was one of the first buildings in the city to have electricity in every room. And in 1872, Frederick and many others in the city, like William Byers, petitioned the Denver Theater to please make your theater into a pleasing and attractive place. Apparently, his establishment was looking very old and ragged. The citizens of Denver desperately wanted some culture and sophistication. So in 1882, the Tabor Opera was built in the most grand and stunning way. The city was gleaming with pride and could not get enough of the performances. Eugenie Putz was in attendance as well as Frederick and Julia. And in 1913, the Tabor Opera celebrated its 30-year anniversary and celebrated by especially inviting the old-timers who were there for the very first opening night. The Post treated them to a special performance in honor of that day, and Eugenie provided the costume in which Mrs. Emma Abbott was dressed in that night and performed. The Tabor Theater brought a huge amount of sophistication that the newfound fortunes of Denver's elite were pining for. I'm hoping one day that I can actually find pictures of that performance. I'm sure they exist somewhere. So the time period between 1883 and 1886 were rough years for the family. It seemed like as soon as Aunt Eugenie was happily married and stepped back from her job and moved outside of the city to the Underhill Ranch, that's when the family drama kicked up a notch. So like we heard last time, in 1885, Henry had made a jackass of himself while starting out his apprenticeship role with his sister Eugenie, and even forgot to get some of the costumes back. He had to go back and beg people to return them. Then in February, Eugenie's nephew, George J., was arrested on a bastardly complaint when he was 20 years old and living in Indiana while he was a draftsman. He was married to Emma Johnson at the time, so this is a little odd. They were married in Denver, but it was unclear if Emma was left in Denver while George was in Indiana, or if she was with him during this time. I had no idea what this was, but apparently it's getting a woman pregnant out of wedlock, and she pressed charges. So he was put in jail and released on a $900 bond. And the outcome of the case was he was ordered to pay $300 in payments and $10 over time. But sadly, 4 months later in May, all the charges were reduced because the poor baby had died. That same month as the baby died, George married an Anna Hurley in Indiana. I mean, George was having a time of his life in his 20s. He's very much the ladies' man. So then the divorce from Emma Johnson is not final until August. So that was a little odd. But in 1883, George Jr., Eugenie Putz, and his dad, George Sr., had all gotten married. And boy, did George Sr. get lucky. He married the elderly widow of the incredibly rich Thomas Pratt. Her name was Mrs. Harriet Pratt. Harriet was 71, while George was just 53 years old. George went from stealing gold as a miner in a Utah mine and a chef in his brother's kitchen to a wealthy, taken care of gentleman almost overnight. And I mean, Harriet had an enormous fortune from her husband, again, the famous Thomas Pratt of New York and London. The family was also involved in a dastardly complaint in which Thomas Pratt was married in England in the year 1821 to a Sarah Pratt, by whom he had issues. They had a few children, and in 1834, Thomas Pratt came alone to the United States without his family, and in 1835 was formally married in New York to another woman, which at the time was Harriet Van Pelt. Harriet was ignorant until 3 years after the ceremony of the fact that his first wife was still living, and they moved to Missouri and had a son, Charles Pratt. Upon his death, he gave his estate to his beloved wife, Harriet Pratt, for life, with the remainder of to his son, Charles Pratt, and appointed Harriet the executor of the will. The children and the wife that he abandoned in England issued a complaint stating that Charles was not their legitimate heir because Harriet and Thomas were not able to be legally married under the bastard law, and that neither he or his mother had entitled to the distributive share of his estate. So this ended up in courts battling whether or not Charles was a bastard, and if so, he argued heavily that it would take away from his high-class lifestyle and good status that he was already accustomed to. The court decided that Charles was not a bastard due to the ignorance of his mother not realizing Thomas was still married, and the estate was then transferred to Harry and Charles. So just 5 years after the court case was finalized, George met Harriet around 1883, and they were married in St. Paul, Minnesota. George lived a grand life, going in between her houses in St. Louis and Chicago, and persuaded her to invest in the future of Denver by developing the Charpiot apartments. Just 2 years after their marriage, in June 1885, George Sr.'s wife, Harriet Pratt, died of tuberculosis. And in her will, Harriet only left George his properties in Denver, which was the Charpiot apartment, and not much more. Her estate again went into a bitter court battle between the abandoned children of Thomas Pratt and her actual son, Charles. George was sort of stuck in the middle, and as I mentioned in part 1, the Charpiot apartments were held up in probate for a year or two while they sorted the details of the will. At one point, George had even brought poor Jacques into the mess because Harriet had fallen in love with a horse he had bred on his farm. Jacques testified that Harriet and George were visiting him at the farm, and Harriet fell in love with the horse and wanted to make it her buggy horse. They loaded up the horse and transported it back to Chicago to be trained. Jacques had insisted that he would not accept her money and wanted to give it as a gift. George testified that on her sickbed that Harriet kept insisting that he must pay Jacques for the horse. Jacques ended up being awarded $500, which is $13,000 today, for the horse, although Jacques was very reluctant to do so. And I loved finding this testimony in Harriet's will because it gave a voice to both Jacques and George, and you can tell a bit about their actual personalities from the true words as they were spoken and recorded in the courts. And after Harriet's death, George didn't hesitate and went on a search for another wife. And just 2 years later, in 1887, George ended up in Southern California where he met another widower, Mary Westcott. They were married in 1890, and she was another widow that came from money before and after her recent marriage. She had some property in San Francisco and other places in Southern California, and seemingly they lived a life of high society in San Diego and built one of the gorgeous Victorians that were part of the early city near Father Horton's house, which was shown here. And he's known as the founder of San Diego. And George tried to get his wife to stay in Denver, but she was a California girl and liked the climate in California better. One article says that Mr. and Mrs. George Charpiot of Denver, who spend the winter and spring in San Diego, returned by last evening's train to make this a permanent home. Some 4 weeks ago, they decided to returned to Denver to spend the summer, intending to proceed to Europe for a year. But Mrs. Charpiot found the Colorado climate unendurable, and fearing that the European client would not be much more kindly, they determined an immediate return. They will erect a residence on Florence Heights. Their removal to San Diego will be followed by that of a large circle of their family, which is very numerous. This must have been sad for George because he never did get to go back and visit France, his childhood home. And however, George, living in California, did allow Eugenie and his children to come and visit on occasion. And I believe this did help rekindle some of their relationship. And 6 months before he died, George decided to go back to Davenport and visit Victor Hoyt once more. It had been 17 years since he had visited, and I believe they probably had a lot to talk about. The last time he was there was for his daughter Eugenie's wedding, and I wonder if they finally made amends with Victor regarding the adoption of his children, even if they had any bad feelings between them, or if they just simply went to catch up with his old brother-in-law. In 1899, George Charpiot died of heart trouble at 66 years old, and 1 month later, his wife Mary died in February. She may have been a bit skeptical of George after the death of his last older widow, and in her will, she notes that George has been, quote, provided for, so she was not awarding him anything from her will. In the Denver newspapers, they acknowledged George as one of the Denver pioneers, mentioning his arrival in 1860, which is the same year as his brother Frederick. Upon hearing the news, Eugenie rushes to San Diego to sort his finances and attend her brother's funeral. Sometime before George's death, Eugenie ended up regaining ownership of the Charpiot apartments, and I'm not clear on the records, but it could have been given to her in George's will or transferred for her to manage it once George decided to move on to Denver and live in San Diego permanently. Either way, the niece and nephews, Eugenie, George, and Charles, ended up gaining 1/3 of the Charpiot apartment property. They held onto it for 6 years until 1905, when the children collectively sold the building. George J. was the last Charpiot to inhabit the building and moved in with his sister to the new home on Lincoln Street that they called the Charpiot Mansion. By 1975, the Charpiot apartments were completely abandoned and boarded up and slated for demolition. In recent years, Unique Properties converted the building into live-work lofts and commercial space and brought life back to the historic first apartment building in Denver. This building is not a protected building, though. And competition between the siblings was heating up because in 1905, while Frederick was still in France, he and his brother-in-law, Jerome Riche, built the apartment flats across the street from Frederick's home at 333 Tremont. They called this area the Charpiot Corner. Henry C. Charpiot, Frederick's son, ended up living in these apartments for some time, which is interesting because he could have lived at the other Charpiot apartments, so how come he didn't? And what's interesting is the way that these apartments were built. They described them as modern apartment houses, but the building has a very similar design to the design of the Charpiot apartments, with a porch on the back and the individual homes that were separated, although from the front they look like one large building. Do you think they were inspired by what Uncle George did? I think they were. So you can see here's the map of the Charpiot apartments, and then this is the building here, and you can see the porch design. And I have to find out what this plaque says here. All right, it's masquerade season again. And when you're getting your program ready, go to Charpiot, the costumer, to look over his stock. You'll find everything that history, art, science, music, or mirth can suggest. Monsieur Henry Charpiot, successor to Madame Putz, the renowned costumer, goes east every year and keeps up the procession with his busy little wife and her nimble fingers, and a bevy of young women who are at work fixing and repairing the fancy toggeries. Everyone knows Monsieur Charpiot, and if you don't know what you want, inquire with him and he will give you all the necessary information. So Henry was doing really well in business and living at Eugenie's building above the costume shop. Henry finds himself traveling all over the Rockies and spends quite a bit of time in Larimer and Cheyenne. I think he made up for his previous life there, as well as his debauch 10 years ago. And we can tell just how good he and the family are doing by this gem of an article. It says, last Wednesday night, during a brief absence from his home, number 1516 Lawrence Street, Henry Charpiot, the veteran costumer of the city, was the victim of one of the most profitable burglaries committed in Denver for months. In a front room stood a large trunk, which Mr. Charpiot utilizes practically as a safety vault and bank. It contained jewelry, silks, opera glasses, and cash valued at $3,000, which is $93,000 in today's dollars. The robbers, who were evidently well aware of the valuable contents of the trunk, only partially looted it. They, however, secured enough diamonds to satisfy an ordinary rapacious crook. They escaped with a pair of diamond earrings for $900, which is $28,000 today. A $200 watch and chain, an opal ring valued at $95, a $125 diamond stud, and a collection of old coins. Either by accident or design, the thieves did not molest a $100 greenback lying in the till of the trunk and $25 in silver. Several necklaces of great value and 3 pairs of opera glasses were not removed. When Mr. Charpiot discovered the robbery yesterday morning, this incident greatly puzzled him. He could not imagine why so much expensive jewelry was left undisturbed unless the robbers sought only for the diamonds. Did you catch that? He didn't understand why the expensive jewelry was undisturbed. Oh, you know, the cheap $28,000 earrings were taken. And he immediately suspected certain persons of the theft and communicated his opinion to Chief of Detectives Farrington. Early in the morning, another surprise awaited Mr. Charpiot. The postman called and handed the costumer a small packed pasteboard box. On opening the box, upon which Mr. Charpiot's name was written in an evidently disguised hand and with his name misspelled, Mr. Charpiot beheld his diamonds stolen from him 36 hours before. Not a stone in the entire collection of jewels valued at $1,400 was missing. Not a scrap of writing accompanied the contents of the precious little box. Detective Chambers also reluctantly admitted his connection with the recovery of the diamonds. At midnight last night, he ran down a woman, a former employee of Charpiot's, who practically admitted the theft and intimated that she would return the diamonds. She kept her promise. So just in that little apartment above the shop, Henry had $43,000 of today's dollars worth of jewelry stolen out of the $93,000 worth of goods hidden in the trunk. So somehow, I think this may have prompted George J's next career, which just a couple of months later, George goes into the safe business.
Yeah.
George J, Aunt Eugenie's nephew, was the youngest child of George Charpiot, and he had left Chicago after being charged with a bastard complaint and moved on to Denver, where his father and Eugenie could help him get back on his feet with his new wife, Anna Hurley. They moved into the Charpiot apartment. George was a prolific engineer and inventor and started his career working as a machinist for the railroad, then became a jeweler. Then in 1895, shortly after his Uncle Henry's trunk had the diamonds stolen, George began working at A.L. Dean & Company Safe Company as a foreman. After that, he worked at Hall's Safe and Bicycle Shop. He learned the skills and became a master in safe refurbishment and design. And he was also called to open locked safe, which always drew a bit of mystery in the newspapers. People would fantasize about what was in the safe, and oftentimes it wasn't the jewels they were helping, but rather old newspapers and liquor bottles. And in 1904, after years of working as a machinist and a bicycle repairman, which was new at that point, and learning the ropes from the Aldine Safe Company, George opened his very own safe company called the Charpiot Safe Company at 1539 Glenarm Street. His safes were highly prized and installed in the areas that needed the most security, such as Denver City Hall, Wells Fargo banks, and more. You can see the famous Cannonball safe in the window of the shop, which is also on display in one of the museums here. The safes were frequently advertised to be dynamite-proof and the best way to foil the Western robbers on the plains. There are several buildings on the National Register of Historic Places, including the Farmers State Bank building, which note the importance of the Charpiot Safe Company bank vaults and deposit boxes as important characteristics that contribute to the importance of these buildings. And numerous contracts with other cities' halls were completed by Charpiot Safe Company, and some still exist today. During Prohibition, George was a smart businessman and went through and reclaimed the safes in the closed-up bars and restaurants. He turned around and sold them for a profit. He was also avidly against the prohibition and used his new platform as a business owner to help fund an anti-prohibition campaign. He would build custom safes into high-end homes as well, as you can see in one of the images here. The safes had such beautiful artwork on the outside of it. But unfortunately, this location of the Charpiot Safe Company on Glenarm Street no longer exists. And in 1909, George even invented a phonographic time lock for safes. He was always trying to keep one step ahead of the burglars, so this was just the next step in technology. The safe is described as only a master's voice will open Denver inventor's device. George J. Charpiot of Denver has invented a phonographic safe lock, which he says can only be opened by the owner. Tests in the presence of experts substantiate the inventor's claim. Instead of a knob on the door, there's a mouthpiece of a telephone. A delicate needle is attached to the diaphragm, the end of the needle resting in the groove of a sound record made on a phonographic cylinder. The word which the safe is locked is thus recorded, and the one who utters it must repeat it before the safe will open again. In the test, a dozen men tried to imitate the voice of the man who locked the safe, but the lock would only respond to the right man. And George Jr. also had some novel ideas and tried to solve a problem wherever he saw one. In 1908, he soon became president of the Denver Safe Deposit Company, which was marketed as the first 24-hour bank that would cater to the working class who works odd hours and has no access to depositing funds. It was built inside of the Standish Hotel, which they advertised to be the smartest hotel in Denver. And in 1916, the Charpiot Safe Company built a brand new building on Blake Street. A new safe factory is to be of steel and concrete, thoroughly modern. It will be a two-story structure with solid concrete floors, especially designed to withstand the strain of the enormous tonnage it must support in the form of the safes. In speaking with one of the relatives of George Charpiot's wife, she said that her brother-in-law worked for the Charpiot Safe Company and traveled around Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, inspecting and repairing safes. And he had all of his fingerprints removed to work on the safe. Now that's dedication to the job and really smart, because you wouldn't want to accidentally point your fingerprints on a safe if there was a big robbery. And in 1924, a Charpiot safe was in every Piggly Wiggly, and they're very proud of it. And in 1931, the contract for 50 vault doors for the new Denver Municipal Building was awarded to the Charpiot Safe Company. Of the 50 doors, 49 were made here in Denver by Denver workmen and from Colorado materials purchased from the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. President George J. Charpiot of the same company said, "The treasurer's door and regular bank vault weighing 20,000 pounds and made of 6-inch solid steel is the only one which will have to be ordered from a manufacturer outside of Colorado. All the doors will be the most modern design and of types approved by the fire insurance underwriters." So I'm not sure about if this is the actual building or if this is a new building built specifically for the RTD offices, but there is a little plaque here, and someday I'll get out there to see exactly what it says. And so even today, the Charpiot safes draw an air of mystery. And in 2020, Councilman Clark's children had been caught up fantasizing about the jewels that may be hidden inside the big lock safe inside their dad's office inside Denver City Hall. They spent a few years trying to crack the safe, and they researched and learned different ways that they could try to break into it. Over the next year, 2020, their diligence paid off. Each time they cracked one of the combination locks in the safe. In the end, though, there was nothing inside the safe.
No.
I know, it's a lot of work. All right, so time to introduce the big man. So this is Henry Charles Charpiot. He is the eldest child of Frederick Charpiot and Julia Riche, and was born while they were living in France in 1863, and he is the eldest cousin of the bunch. So Henry Charles graduated from Cornell, as well as graduating from Columbia Law School in 1889. He won one of the first 4 prizes in constitutional law from Columbia. He took the Denver scene by storm and quickly positioned himself as one of the top lawyers in the city and passed the Colorado bar. In 1899, Henry Charles became the French consular agent of Denver. And apparently there was a large need for a strong lawyer in Denver, and he was wildly successful. He helped to facilitate many relationships between international mining companies and Denver, as well as negotiated the export of Denver coal to France. He also held the chair of constitutional law at the University of Colorado. He made a great reputation for himself, and was always very boastful of his position as the international lawyer. It was kind of like he was the only one. Everything was the international lawyer. It was nice to have a lawyer in the family, though, since he did help supply all the family who needed it with their passport applications and even helped to battle the federal government to try and save some of the family's properties in Denver. He handled many of the top cases both locally and internationally, and had an incredible reputation and business record. And I love this little sketch here of him being an interpreter during one of the trials. So in 1902, Henry, the uncle, sold his business to W.E. Pratt and moved to Los Angeles with his wife. What is also interesting is that you see in 1894, Henry Charles transferred his property at Grant Street between Exposition, Ohio, to near Aunt Eugenie's house, to a Mary Charpiot, which is the same orphan's name that we talked about in part 1. Also, Molly Charpiot, his wife, later sold the property in 1903. So this is another instance of where the mystery of the Mollys and Marys continue. Also in 1903, Eugenie P. Underhill began looking for someone to attend a 10-week scholarship in the modern school of business. She was really savvy and built herself an empire, and she really wanted to have someone teach some of the skills that she had learned. And in 1909, after dealing in costumes and fine French millinery, she looked for an energetic businessman willing to work and share one half of her business. She really wanted to take someone to take care of it long after she retired, or maybe she just was really trying to retire and wanted to get it off her hands. But then Henry died in 1905, and in one instance regarding his will, it is said that he no longer had use of his hands, so he could not write, implying some sort of accident or ailment due to age. Unfortunately, his will became the brunt of jokes because it said, "I, Henry Charpiot, give and bequeath to my husband, Henry Charpiot." So even more of a joke is that because Henry Charles Charpiot, his nephew, who was the attorney, had the same name, and they confused he and his nephew, the famous international lawyer, and thought that the famous lawyer made a will out to himself. The newspapers had so much fun with this, but they didn't check the facts because the will was filed in Los Angeles and Henry Charles was living in Paris at the time. So after Henry died, his wife Molly lived in their home in Los Angeles until 1908, and then she moved back to her family, the Coffeys, in St. Joseph, Missouri, and she started referring to herself again as Mary at that point. In 1910, she was living with her brother, but in 1914, all of Mary's property was sold, and she was deemed insane when she was 62 years old. I'm not sure what happened to her after that. And in her census records, it shows that she never had children. So we may never find out the mystery of who baby Mary Charpiot is and who her parents actually were. In 1901, after Henry's health seems to have faded, he moved to San Diego. Eugenie, again, seeming like she was feeling the weight of time, decided to sell her beloved costumer building and home. She had been living in California at the time as well, maybe visiting Henry or just enjoying the seaside life. And Miss Eugenie P. Underhill of California's 2-story building was sold through Wolf, Wed, and Chittenden to a Miss M.K. Liebhardt, who was the sister of G.G. Liebhardt, the commission man. The property sold for $13,200, which was $572,000 in today's money. The building covers one lot and is accompanied by the Denver Novelty Company. And Miss Liebhardt made the purchase as a permanent investment. So this sort of ends her costumer career. And there were a few ladies' societies in Denver, but the Pioneer Ladies Aid Society was created to specifically financially help pioneer women as they reach old age. It was a wonderful society of women supporting women. And as we know, the women did a lot in pioneer days to help keep the household going through although much of the fame and the credit usually was given to the husband. They felt that the wives of the pioneer women contributed so much to the beginnings of Denver, and they wanted to give back to them. This was meant to be a complementary society to the Sons of Colorado, since women weren't allowed to be involved in that one. As the oldest pioneers died off, the benefits also extended to their children as well. And some of the requirements in order to be in this society were that you arrived in Colorado prior to 1861, and you would need references and witnesses to attest to your arrival, and then you would get a certificate that proves that you're part of this pioneer club. And this was definitely settled at the annual meeting of the society when J.D. Howland introduced a resolution to the fact that 12 of the older residents who had done much for the society should be made honorary members. But Mr. Howland based his resolution on the fact that Governor Evans, Bela Hughes, and Henry Villard, who were not eligible to membership in the society, had been made honorary members. Mr. Howland's resolution was defeated by a large majority on the grounds that it would establish an undesirable precedent. And the use of the title pioneer, which is used by several business firms in the city, was next discussed, and it was decided that according to the Articles of Incorporation filed by the society, the word can be legitimately employed only by those firms which were established before 1861. So Frederick and Julia were heavily involved in these clubs and would most often host parties and election celebrations at their home. Julia Reich, Frederick's wife, was third vice president in 1898, but was heavily involved most years. Her work is described as a member of the Ladies' Relief Society who has done much active work in connection with it among the poor. She was always ready. Her disposition to relieve without degrading the applicant, to minister to the needs without destroying the self-respect, has made this lady's activities among persons pressed by necessity more than ordinarily valuable. And Eugenie finally had some time after she retired to devote back to the community after Frederick's death. And she became the fourth vice president in 1908 and in 1911. Their duties included visiting the old pioneer women who needed aid. They visited them every few weeks, checking in on them, seeing what they need, and they reported it in their logs, any conversations, ailments, sicknesses, or needs that they might have. For example, one woman was having trouble with poor quality coal, but she couldn't afford butter. Another had a prolonged sickness that they would check on her and make sure she had enough to eat. If a pioneer lady needed funds, they would usually provide money to them, often about $3, which is about $100 today. Eugenie often helped make these rounds to visit the pioneers, but also really enjoyed being on the planning committees for the banquets and events that the society would throw. And in 1881, the Sons of Colorado, otherwise known as the Society of Colorado Pioneers, began meeting and getting together to reminisce about what they've seen. We are lucky because the menu from the 1882 second meeting was saved, and this is the oldest relic of a menu in Denver. And you can see all types of dishes that they served. And oh, I forgot to mention, this is at Charpiot. This is the Charpiot menu. What was I going to say? Oysters were a specialty of Charpiot's hotels, so of course it was served up in the highest of style. And it's described as the scattered remnants of the vanguard of Colorado civilization to the number of 300, including their descendants, assembled at Charpiot's hotel, and had a genuine jubilation in rehashing the incidents and reminiscences of the days of 59 and 60, when our beautiful state was merely a questionable oasis in the great American desert, a vague glimmering promise of future greatness, which only the brave and resolute could grasp, nothing more. Silvery grizzled locks and rugged but generous faces, beaming with good cheer and inherent vitality, were prominent, though there were sufficient of the fair daughters and sturdy songs of the old pioneers to lend variety and contrast to the merry company. Extensive preparations had been made by Charpiot and Son, and the hotel arrangements were all that could be desired. The appointments of the banquet were very elaborate. The tables were loaded with flowers and confectionery, and the many were simply delectable, and must have furnished the old settlers a striking contrast to the rude cabins and severe fare of their early Colorado life. In place of the coughing of the pines and the murmuring of the mountain brooks, which old times had been the lullaby and the requiem of the many brave pioneers, the west notes of an orchestra and the dancing hall pervaded the dining room and regaled the ears of the banqueters. After dinner, President W.N. Byers interrupted the cheerful buzz of conversation and introduces the Honorable Wilbur Stone, who presented an address to the attentive audience, in which he recounted the dangers, difficulties, hardships, aspirations, amusing incidents, and funny experiences of pioneer life, which, after appropriate toasts were drank and original poems read and other speeches made, the music and dancing kept up till morning. Both in the Pioneers Ladies Society and the Colorado Society of Pioneers, there were a lot of names that you'd actually recognize from our past History Club meetings, like Thomas Garrett, builder of the street at Broadway and original apple farmer, Arthur Pierce, owner of the South Denver Eye and Lincoln Street resident, John Daly, also Lincoln Street resident, A.G. Rose, Milton Estes, and more. In 1883, Adeline was sent to France to complete her education. They went back and forth and visited Henry Charles in New York, then went abroad to visit Adeline in Paris. During this time, Frederick and Julia decided to start the process to move permanently to France and began to build a house in Branche, shown here, in which they called Chateau Charpiot. In 1884, Adeline married Henry Bonagard. In Branche, the Bonagard family was a well-respected and celebrity-type family. They ran 3 different mills within the town. Their palatial home was 3 doors down from Charpiot's, who, with his brothers, founded a business in the grain trade. They each had a home in the French seaside style within Branche, and Adeline enjoyed a nice life and at times lived with Frederick and Julia in their chateau when the grandchildren were young. In 1903, Henry Charles and his family had already left for Paris to start his international law firm, and Frederick and Julie decided in 1904 to permanently move as well to be closer to their grandchildren. The whole city of Denver seemed to throw them party after party, and as each day grew closer to their departure, it was another newspaper celebration, accolades wishing them bon voyage. But we still know almost nothing about what happened to Adeline. We know that starting a year after their marriage, poor Adeline had 5 stillbirths or miscarriages in a row. But good news came her way, and in 1906, it shows that she had 2 small children, Nellie and Paul. Paul was named after Henry's mother, and Nellie was named after her cousin, Julie Nellie Charpiot, who married Horace Bennett on the Charpiot side. From 1919 to 1944, Henry Barnagard was the mayor of Branche. Adeline disappears from records about 1915, with one small mention in an article pertaining to being a guest of a funeral. And without this census in 1906, the history books and search records have been completely quiet on Adeline. And now we know about her children. And another clue is in 1929, Henry Charles transfers all of the remaining Charpiot properties in Denver from a joint ownership between he and his sister to having sole ownership. So it seems she was living until at least 1929, but no records exist that I found so far. Frederick and Jerome Riche had quite a nice real estate empire, but in 1905, proceedings began by the U.S. government in which they were deciding on a new location for a post office. Instead of choosing any of the large amounts of empty land in Denver, they chose the location of 19th Street between Champa and Stout. Unfortunately, this was the location of one of Frederick's beloved buildings. A fierce battle began, and Frederick and one of the other owners were unwilling to sell. Unfortunately, even the most beloved people in the city aren't immune from eminent domain. The announcement that the United States Treasury Department has decided on the site for the post office is accompanied by the trouble of its own. Owners of the 3.5 lots are unwilling to sell, and litigation is imminent. From present indications, unfortunately, seems there's little hope of avoiding the litigation that goes with condemnation proceedings. Of the 32 lots in the block, 28.5 blocks have been offered for $480,000. This leaves 3.5 blocks, which the owners are unwilling to sell and would have to be purchased for $30,000 in order to let the amount come within the appropriation of $500,000 made by the last session of Congress. Condemnation proceedings already have been ordered on these. 2 of these lots on the corner of 19th and Stout are owned by Henry Charpiot, now of Paris, who is understood to decline sale under any circumstances. And in 1907, in the midst of battling to keep his properties, Frederick Charpiot dies in France. The news came as a shock to everyone around him as they thought he was in relatively good health. The city of Denver mourned. Mr. Frederick Charpiot has been cut down from the fast-thinning ranks, resolved that in the death of Mr. Charpiot, the Pioneer Ladies' Aid Society has lost a friend whose hand and heart are always open to the needs, and many kindly words and deeds are treasured in our memories. Frederick Charpiot died in Branche on the 14th and left Denver in 1907 to spend 1904 to spend his declining days in his native land. Mr. Charpiot had been in poor health for some time, but nevertheless, the death came as a shock to many of his Denver friends, among whom the pioneers of which society both Mr. Charpiot and his wife were members. Many articles came out about this time and recalled all the past days of Delmonico's. They talked about the brilliant and frequent dinners, describing it as the center of Bohemia for the cosmopolitan life that distinguished the frontier town 30 to 40 years ago. By 1907, the Delmonico restaurant still stood at 1540 Larimer, but just a short time later, it wasn't even a rooming house anymore. Upon hearing the news, Eugenie rushed back from San Diego to help take care of and comfort her family. It is interesting, though, because this is the first article that now acknowledges that she was an important pioneer in that, quote, she needs no introduction to the old-timers. It seemed like Frederick's shadow was so large that it blocked her from getting the light, and Eugenie was finally being seen. Unfortunately, after Frederick's death, the buildings in the post office site were transferred to his wife, Julia Reich, upon his death. Turns out that the city specifically did not survey the Charpiot properties in their appraisal, with left any leftover money out of the $500,000 to the Charpiots. So $50,000 valuation that they were requested, and they said that they requested $50,000 valuation, but they ended up with only $16,000. The government pulled a very sneaky and unfair fight to get the Charpiot property condemned for them to move forward, and the properties were all demolished in 1907. So Henry Charles and his sister Adeline received the finest of everything growing up. Even in 1882, Henry received small acting roles in various productions at the Tabor Opera House, and his sister received smaller roles in dancing performances as well. Henry participated in dancing clubs like the Rosetta Dancing Club in Denver. This involvement and adoration of all things theater plays a big role in the future for both him and his children. And Henry married Louis Gertrude Zimmerman, whose family was also a pioneer family of Denver. They were married in Clayton County, Iowa, which, if you remember, is the county where most of the Charpiots started out. Upon hearing of the birth of their first child, Julie Charpiot, a note was sent to Wisconsin, where the parents of Louise Zimmerman lived, and said that they would once more receive the affectionate greeting from cherub lips of Grandma and Grandpa, which proud titles they will wear in consequence of the birth into the household of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Charpiot, a bouncing baby girl. And Julie was the absolute princess of the Charpiot family and was treated as such. She and Louise were very much part of high society in Denver, and Julie was a great dancer as well and was featured in several performances, one of which was called her skirt dance. And we do get a bit of a hint into society life, though, and it came to light that one of the leaders of society were favoring specific members of the society and their children. This came out when only certain members of that society had their children prominently featured in the performances, while others were left out. And it turns out that Mrs. Martin was accused of using her influence with the press. Mrs. Martin's husband is a well-known newspaper man. She was charged with suppressing the names of certain women from appearing in press notices, thereby dooming to oblivion certain women who had expressed no desire to be doomed to any such a place. Now nobody knows when the cantata will be rehearsed or who will be in it, as some of the members of the club want their children in, and Miss Martin, who selected the children with regard to their talent instead of family connection, may have to reorganize the whole thing and begin her work over. But she will make an effort to keep, at least in part, as the Beale Orchestra, little Julia Charpiot, daughter of Henry C. Charpiot, a shapely little girl who is to do a skirt dance, little Vera, and a few others. So Julia's talent seemed to shine through all of this drama. But part of me wonders whether Eugenie Putz was a victim of this catty behavior too. After all, she was prominent in society, but she really didn't fit the mold, nor was she married, and she didn't have any children. She worked hard and was devoted to her business. And I wondered, because many articles where the rest of the family is featured, Eugenie is often absent from the notes. It could also be that she was just too busy to attend, but this article really made me begin to question. So Louise and Henry wanted the best education, and just like Henry's father did, Henry and Louise moved to France to raise Julie in the same fashion that he was raised. Louise had several health problems throughout her life, and sometimes they left for California and vacationed on the coast for a period of time to benefit the health of Mrs. Charpiot. However, in Branche, France, the home of Frederick Charpiot, on August 7, 1909, Louise Zimmerman died at 50 years old. A few years later, a Chicago heiress has been pursued around the world by a rejected suitor, Henry Charles Charpiot. Miss Edith Lee Baker, heiress to the missions of her deceased father, Edward Pomeroy Baker, who was the president of the Western Refrigeration Company in Chicago. She is prominent among the women artists of Europe, outdoor enthusiast, and one of Chicago's most prominent debutantes. and is the heroine of this pretty romance. Henry Charles Charpiot, wealthy and famous international lawyer, is the persistent and successful suitor. Miss Baker and Mr. Charpiot met for the first time about 3 years ago. While visiting parents in company of her mother, she was introduced to Charpiot, who decided within a few weeks of her meeting that she was the one woman who could console him for his loss of his first wife, Louise Zimmerman, who died in 1909. On one side of it was a case of love at first sight, but Miss Baker was wrapped up in her art and love of outdoor sports. The girl was not of the same mind and rejected her ardent suitor, returned to Chicago. Her rejections of his advances did not shatter the determination of the attorney, and several other proposals followed in rapid-fire succession. At last, the young lady concluded to make a tour of the world with her mother. So did Charpiot. He followed her on the next steamer, and although he used all the diplomacy that he has learned from the practice on international law during 9 years, he proposed in Tangier, Cairo, India, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Manila, San Francisco, Chicago, New York. But according to the latest cable reports, he did not receive the desired answer until last week when the party arrived at their starting point, Paris. Miss Baker capitulated, and Charpiot could tell his friends that he had won the most important and hardest case he's ever fought. The announcement of the engagement follows a courtship of a year's duration, which has been watched with the greatest of interest by Denver people who know Charpiot. Miss Baker and her mother have lived in Paris several years, having inherited considerable property. Mrs. Edmund Dodge is a sister of Mrs. Baker and says, aside from his other qualities, I fancy that it was his tenacity that won him success. Mrs. Dodge said tonight, at any rate, they went back to Paris engaged. And if you search for this article, you will literally find hundreds of thousands of the same article. This story was listed in practically every single newspaper in every town in the US. And their engagement and wedding included equally as many articles celebrating a follow-up to what seemed like one of the greatest love stories of that day. So beautiful. So why was Henry so smitten with Miss Baker that he chased her around the world and went through all of those rounds of rejection time and time again? Well, this woman was incredible. She was a celebrity of her time due to her incredible feats as a mountain climber, and she was the first girl to climb the Breithorn and made the trek to the top and back within 24 hours. She was in hundreds of papers for this story. Then she did it again and broke the Alps record for climbing the steepest side of the Jungfrau mountain. She also has the distinction of climbing the Tischelhorn, and the peak so celebrated in history, tragedy, and romance, the towering Matterhorn, which is more than 15,000 feet high. So I just think that Edith, when she was living in Denver, must have loved her time here with all the 14er mountains. But I couldn't find any stories of what mountain she might have climbed here, or if she did, or she put it behind her. But I'm sure she would have loved that. And if you remember, Aunt Eugenie must have told the story over and over to Henry growing up of how she had climbed the Rocky Mountains. And now Henry finds a great woman who is conquering the greatest of mountains. And not only that, but she has an incredible voice, and from a young age was singing operatic in Chicago. And Henry loved the theater and art. And it seems that Henry had found his perfect match and a wonderful influence for his little daughter, Julie. So no wonder he chased her around the world. And in 1912, Henry Charles decided, oh, forgot to mention here. I didn't copy it. Okay, well, so the other cool thing about Edith was that she was also into hotels. So she owned the Colonial Hotel and a few others in Chicago. And if we remember from our last presentation, when the Charpiots first arrived in the US from France, the first thing they did to start their life here was they created the French Hotel in Chicago. So I think it's just really wonderful that, you know, Henry finds himself following exactly in his father's footsteps and getting involved in the hotel business in Chicago and basically everything that culminates what the family was about. I just loved it. I added that slide today because I found all that out. Okay, so in 1912, Henry Charles Charpiot decided to help out Mayor Spear and helped facilitate the building and contracts for a beautiful fountain that he wanted installed as part of the City Beautiful movement. It wasn't easy, though. After Speer left office, Mayor Arnold stopped the payment for $2,645, being the balance of the full payment for the Dusseldorf fountain that Speer ordered to be made by Max Blondin in Paris for the Civic Center, on the grounds that there was no contract for it, and he did not believe that it should be bought. The mayor's action brought out an interesting story of this fountain as exemplifying Speer's recklessness with money of the taxpayers. Speer saw the Blondin fountain in Dusseldorf, Germany, during his tour of Europe, and conceived the idea of having one made just like it for Civic Center, taking the money out of the park fund to pay for it. He saw that Henry C. Charpiot, now living in Paris, and got him to act as the agent for the city. There were numerous conferences between Charpiot and others, and finally Blondin offered to make the fountain for approximately $6,000, one half to be paid at once and one half when finished, and he reserved the right to produce more replicas of the Dusseldorf fountain, which prompted Charpiot to write Speer under the date of July 23, 1912. And in the letter he said, "This seems to be a very stiff price to pay for a work of art which may be cheapened by the artist multiplying the same, which changes the whole basis of the contract, namely from the purchase of a unique work of art to the purchase of a model which has become a mere article of commerce." However, this did not deter Speer from sending a check for half the cost of the fountain to Charpiot with instruction to pay it over to Blondin. Charpiot, however, still held back, and Speer forced the park board to pass a resolution ordering the fountain and guaranteeing its payment so that Charpiot could not be held personally responsible. And then Charpiot paid the money over to the sculptor. Now Blondin wants the rest of the money before he will let go of the fountain out of his studio. The city still has all the carriage of the monument from Paris to Denver, the house custom duties, the base to be built, and other expenses that will add another $2,000 to the cost. Mayor Arnold said today that he had held back the payment until he can look further into proposition. He said, perhaps it would be best to stop now with the $2,900 loss than to pay out another similar sum and another $3,000 more. So a year later in 1913, the fountain, which is of white marble, was packed in the hold of a steamship Chicago. It weighed 35 tons and cost $7,000. Shipping and the cost of erection will increase this sum to $10,000. The fountain was ordered by Henry C. Charpiot, formerly of Denver Man. And 5 years after it was installed, a newspaper published a rumor that it had been made by the Germans, or at least funded by them. There was a lot of anti-German sentiment at the time, and the president of the Denver Art Association felt compelled to write a letter. He said it would be unfortunate to permit prejudice to arise against the children's fountain through any suggestion that might detract from its sentimental interest or mar one's enjoyment of its beauty and charm. There was a duplicate of the fountain in the city of Dusseldorf, indicates that only that the people of Dusseldorf appreciate the subtle and suggestive art of the statue. We are merely indebted to Dusseldorf for permission to reproduce it. They soon moved the fountain from Civic Center to City Park. And he writes again, our children's fountain is in its new setting and it's great improved, and the environment adds much to its beauty and interest. The sunlight is now directly upon it, and the background of the water and trees and shrubs adds greatly to its general effect. The setting lends itself to the legend of the fountain, which is, I understand, that the children have been bathing and coming up and out of the water over the rocks, discovering 3 frogs. The surprise and delight and the wonderful expression of the faces which the artist portrayed so skillfully. So unfortunately, in the 1940s, the mountain was defaced and damaged heavily by anti-German citizens. By 1848, the fountain was almost destroyed, and a local Denver sculptor had the sculpture remade in a cast of her own children. In the 1950s, the children's fountain was restored with plaster, but by the 1970s, these efforts began to fail. By this time, the neighborhood had also decomposed, and there was no initiatives to restore the city's treasure. You can see from the photo in 1985, where graffiti was etched into the marble, the feet broken off the children, the frogs were stolen and damaged. In the 1990s, the community rallied around the neighborhood renewal efforts, and plans to resuscitate the park included a restoration of the fountain. Today, the feet and noses have been restored. You can see on the left here is what it looks like today. I mentioned before about how this family seems to have disappeared from history for some reason, but what's funny though, is that even in modern documents for this fountain, the Charpiot name is completely misspelled. I mean, I tell you, so if anyone has seen the movie Coco, it's like the Charpiots were one step away from being forgotten. So now they are loving their new lives in France, and they write back to Denver boasting all about it, and it appears in newspapers. However, in 1914, World War I broke out, and France was under threat. Fresh from the heart of war-torn France, Mr. and Mrs. Charpiot are enthusiastic over the demeanor of the soldiers and citizens. Mrs. Charpiot was one of the first women to offer her services to the Ambulance Association in France and has observed from a point of vantage the spirit of France. It is in the hospital, she declares, that true heroism is manifested. Never did she hear a French soldier, no matter how serious might be his disfigurement under the blast of German fire, lament his fate. One hope of the wounded French soldier is that he may recover sufficiently to go back into service. Mrs. Charpiot called attention to the manner in which the French women have taken up in the pursuance of industry and occupations normally occupied by men and proved themselves marvelously efficient. Yes, in this situation, the word suffrage isn't mentioned in connection with the French women, he says. What the French woman can be judged by is what she has done during the present great crisis. Imagine what it means when you learn that the French peasant women, with the aid of the old men and the children over the age of 12, planted, cultivated, and harvested a normal crop in the whole of France outside of the invaded regions in the north. Everywhere I saw women driving and moving the harvesting machines, the hay rakes, and loading the wagons. They did all that scarcely realizing how efficient they were in doing, almost unaided, the rural work of the entire nation. I take my hat off in admiration to the French women. In discussing the Zeppelins, Mr. Charpiot explains that the protective war zone about Paris minimizes the danger from the source, but the North Sea with its fogs makes London the chief prey. Concerning the speculations as to the probable attitude of civilians towards those of other warring European nations, Charpiot declares the Frenchman is not a good hater, but believes that the Germans will not be held in good affection for quite a while, but in the forgiving heart of the Parisian, even in the forgiving heart of the Parisian. But the war, he says, has cleaned up misunderstandings of years between the French and the English. The French bore 9/10 of the burden of the battle, but what is more remarkable is that the population of Paris, knowing that for 5 days the fate of the French race and nation were being contested against the most powerful and best organized army in the world has ever seen, the population remained calm. There was neither evidence nor fear nor excitement. I observed this myself, for neither my wife nor myself quitted Paris during those fateful days, and after the population of Paris knew that the German armies had been beaten and were in full retreat, there was no historical manifestations of joy. The French took their defeat calmly. The ordinary emergencies, the French were apt to be noisy in the expression of approval or disapproval, but when the nation is fighting for its very life, it is calm and collective. So by 1916, the war intensified significantly, and they had experienced 2 Zeppelin strikes. They fled to Denver in 1916 and thought things were getting better, so they went back to France. In May 1917, the family is back again in the US in what must have been the most terrifying voyage of their lives. Just in April, the Germans were targeting US ships at sea and attempting to sink them using the German U-boats, similar to what had happened in 1915 with the sinking of the Lusitania. Henry decides to take up his offices in the US at this time, and they began to find a temporary home in New York for a while before continuing on to Chicago, the original home of Edith. In 1917, Edith and Henry's first child was born, and what was his name? Henry Charles Charpiot Jr. So they're continuing the tradition of using the same names over and over. And in 1922, he gives an update on the conditions of France in the newspaper. The heroic rally of the French people to overcome what appeared to be intolerable conditions of chaos in the devastated regions of northern France since war. The attitude of the French people is now hopeful, and they have lost the bitterness that was so manifest for the first few months after the war ended. The French government has sent billions of dollars for the restoration of its devastated regions and to reestablish its line of communications. Every foot of the railroads has to be rebuilt, as well as the roads. The heavy burden has meant the government of France was compelled to call upon the people for extraordinary loans, and in many cases actually drained the purses of those who have reserves. Mr. Charpiot continued, originally, it was intended that the money taken for restoration purpose would be repaid from the indemnity to be collected from Germany, but the failure of Germany to make the payments has caused severe financial strain on the citizens of the government. Mr. Charpiot praised the industry of the French peasants and asserted that they have accomplished the overwhelming task again, making hospitable the land in the devastated regions. When the German armies marched from France, every foot of ground was hopelessly torn and devastated. Shell holes were everywhere, and it appeared that the ground never again could be cultivated. But the farmers dug huts for themselves in the earth. They began work with the implements furnished with them, and now have nearly 90% of the devastated regions ready and are tilling the soil for the living. He declared that despite the hardships of the war and afterward, the French people are now again the same buoyant, hopeful class as before the war, and life seemed to go back to normal. They soon moved to San Francisco, where they settled for the rest of their days and raised their son. And it's funny because the last Halloween I spent in San Francisco was a few days before we moved in this house. My family and I were randomly trick-or-treating in this neighborhood, and only through this research did I realize we trick-or-treated at Henry Charpiot's house, which is down here. So beginning in 1887, Eugenie visited her brother George and his new wife in San Diego often. George even arrived in San Francisco, and they stayed there while speculating on more property and possibly meeting his sister, the sister of his new wife, Mary Westcott, who lived there. Eugenie began to fall in love with San Diego, and you see her toying with the idea of staying there forever and leaving all of Denver behind her. In 1904, one article even states that Mrs. E.P. Underhill of Denver has been in the city for several days this week. She owns property here and is so much pleased with the place that she may decide to move here permanently. For many years, she spends several months during the winter in San Diego and goes back and forth and enjoys her retired life with more freedom. Things changed, though, for her beloved adopted daughter, Eugenie, and Eugenie decides to stay in Denver to help her family once more. So here's the story of Eugenie Charpiot Jones, the niece. Eugenie M. Charpiot lived with Uncle Joseph Putz and Aunt Eugenie in Denver, where she was one of the first sets to graduate from the St. Mary's School. When she became of age, she too, like her brothers, received a fine education. After growing up, Aunt Eugenie sent her niece back to Iowa to attend the Immaculate Conception Girls Academy, which was also designed by Victor Hoyt. Eugenie was a talented musician and highly celebrated. Her harp solos were each called forth with enthusiastic applauses of the audience. Showers of bouquets rewarded this year's graduate, Eugenie Charpiot, when upon the harp she rendered Off the Silly Night. When Eugenie graduated, she received medals and highest honors in piano and harp. She received another wreath for amiable and polite deportment most years that she attended. Even after she graduated, she was honored with awards and special trips as an example of the quality of their graduates. The Academy seemed to think really, really highly of her. After graduation, on July 24, 1879, Eugene married a local boy named Oliver P. Jones. There was a grand wedding at St. Marguerite's Church this morning. It is not too often that a couple starts in wedded life under happier auspices other than those which attended the wedding of Miss Eugenie Charpiot and Mr. Oliver Jones. It was a brilliant affair. The auditorium was crowded and with the friends of the parties. The bride was beautiful in her modest yet rich becoming attire, and the groom well became his betrothed. At the bride's home, where friends gathered in large numbers, was a noble display of gifts, among which were noted these presents. Oliver P. Jones, husband of the bride, made her a present of a fine piano. Mr. and Mrs. Hoyt, uncle and aunt of the bride, a complete set of silver knives, forks, and spoons. The father of the bride, George Charpiot, gave some fine presents, one of which was a check for $500, which is $14,000 today. My God, I would have loved that. Mrs. Putz, aunt of the bride, gave a fine gold watch, also a fine trousseau, elegantly furnished. And I didn't know what a trousseau was, but it was a dowry or hope chest. And I'm sure she fitted it with the best fineries and beautiful clothing, linens. And Mr. Charles Charpiot, brother of the bride, a handsome china set. And Mr. and Mrs. Jones, parents of the groom, a handsome set of elegantly upholstered furniture and splendid French plate glass mirror. The array of marriage gifts was splendid and costly indeed, and showed the warmth of the esteem cherished for the bride. She is a gifted lady. The groom was for years a competent and respected clerk at the CR&P Freight House and is now a grocery merchant on Brady Street. Mr. and Mrs. Jones took their departure for Mackinac on the first train, and they'll be absent a fortnight. A year and a half later, her first child, Oliver G. Jones, was born. 4 years later, Herbert Aloysius Jones, and then another 9 years later, their little girl, Ethel Eugenie Jones, was born. Eugenie and Oliver stayed in Davenport for many years and at one time lived with Victor Hoyt and his wife at their home. Oliver's railroad job took him to Coney House, and then they finally settled in Denver about 1885. They first moved in with Aunt Eugenie and her then husband, Austin Underhill, before they moved to their home on Welton Street. Oliver worked for the D&R Rio Grande Railroad as a clerk for many years, and Eugenie was a socialite and took care of the house and children. In approximately 1894, Aunt Eugenie builds the Charpiot mansion at 402 South Lincoln for her adopted daughter. Eugenie and Oliver had been living with Aunt Eugenie in the Charpiot mansion and raised her children, Oliver, Herbert, and Ethel. Ethel may have been born, Ethel was born in 1893, and it is possible that Ethel was born in the house since records are completely missing on when exactly the house was built. The house originally had 4 lots and maybe even some gardens on the adjacent lots, which would have been common of the other mansions built in the area around the time. The front window of the house even had a beautiful stained glass window with a crown. The crown is similar in design of the French heraldry, including Napoleon's crown. You can see here, it's hard to see, but it looks most similar to that. And as a side note, in my house, there is stained glass with the French fleur-de-lis. Oliver, her husband, became really close friends with her brother, George J. They would travel around together and seemed like they were close friends for decades. George and Eugenie had many combined parties for family and friends, often having his cousin, Henry Charles, and Uncle Frederick and Aunt Julia over for dinner. George was all over town and president and founder of many men's clubs and was the life of the party, and Oliver was there with him. And these nights caused some trouble, as seen from this article below. Mrs. Eugenie Jones trailed her husband to a pantry. He had planned some pleasure. He arranged in company Mrs. R to a masquerade ball, but Mrs. Jones intervened with a very vigorous veto. His wife trailed him one night and then parked and listened through the windows. What she saw and heard drove her to a fury around the front door, and she consumed 2 kilowatts of electricity and continuously ringing the bell before the lady of the house responded. "I want my husband," she demanded. "I don't know anything about him. He is in your house, you brazen hussy." "He is not. I'll just see." She saw, and she pushed her rival aside and bolted back to the kitchen. Hubby was in the pantry examining the tinware. "Oh, you wrench." It was at the end of this stormy 3-sided interview, the husband was dragged home, where his wife told him to leave the house and never come back. The irate woman, Mrs. Eugenie C. Jones, said that for 2 years, her husband, Oliver P. Jones, clandestinely visited a married woman known at the divorce proceedings as Mrs. R, and chose the nighttime for his sub-trust calls, knowing that Mr. R was employed away from home at night. Frequently, these visits lasted until a very late hour, Mrs. Jones says. "He paid this woman improper intent," she says. "He remained away 2 months, and then she relented on account of their children, not desiring to inflict upon them a domestic scandal. One of the sons is a cadet at the United States Naval Academy, and the other is a student at the Leland Stanford University." In 1904, foreseeing the final steps of their divorce, ads in the newspaper start to advertise the front room of the Charpiot mansion for rent. A month after the divorce was finalized, Aunt Eugenie transferred the lots next to the mansion to her niece, Eugenie Jones, and filed the permit for 408 South Lincoln. They needed some additional space so they could build the exact same house that they had built in 1903 at 412 South Lincoln. So they ended up giving an additional 6 foot of space, which is why the 2 houses are practically built on top of each other. Eugenie provided her niece with enough income from the potential rent to help sustain her and her children and provide for her future. This home became a treasure to Eugenie as a generous gift from her aunt. And just like the Charpiot apartments, the family bounced around between the 4 houses, depending on their place in life. Eugenie usually lived with one of her great-grandnephews. And I mean, who wouldn't want to live with Aunt Eugenie because she cooked so well and she had that delicious French food. And for a while, Eugenie and Aunt Eugenie tried to turn the mansion into a rooming house. You start to see the advertisements for single rooms with cleaning and food included. One ad reads, "Private room and private home, with or without board, French cooking, best table in the city, reasonable price, 402 South Lincoln. Excellent tables, good rooms, home-like settings, room and board, $5 a week, home cooking and rooms for light housekeeping." You also start to see funny remnants of Eugenie's past life being sold. In 1908, 225 square feet of red stone sidewalk, cheap, 408 South Lincoln. In 1909, for sale, real estate signs, 3x4 feet made galvanized sheet iron, cheap, 408 South Lincoln. And they even sold eggs and chickens while Eugenie was living in 408 South Lincoln. Around 1920, they sold the property, and you start to see some ads from the new owners. Some of the items seems like it may have belonged to Eugenie, but were left in the attic, or they were renovating the kitchen. It seems at this point, though, this may have been the date that they converted the single-family home into the 4 different units. You see that they start to rip out the kitchen and sell the items in one ad. They have for sale a beautiful 6x10 paneled oak front icebox, 3 doors, 4 mirrors, a U.S. slicer and stand, almost new, a Leda electric scale, 1 oak cash register, a Herbert grinder, 18-foot walnut refrigerator counter, and 1 10-foot iron meat rack, and then 1 square maple block. Will sell for all the price of an icebox. And George divorced from Anna Hurley in 1909 in another tumultuous divorce. But years later, he seemed to find love in Laura Hanson. They all seemed to have a lot of fun together, and they moved through society and seemed like the life of the party wherever they went. George and his sister Eugenie almost monthly would hold society parties and bridge luncheons that made all of the papers. All the children, relatives, and society friends were in attendance, and they seemed to be the best toasts in Denver. At one particular New Year's Eve party in 1914, a small baby was left on the doorstep of the home during the party. A maid who answered the bell returned from the door carrying in her arms a foundling boy, a fine, healthy youngster about 2 months old, who blinked in astonishment at the assembly and the crowd and crowed in approval of the party. They were absolutely thrilled with the young boy and decided to adopt him on the spot. They had no children of their own, and this was a great opportunity. They said they'd have to throw another party to name him. The child, for one reason or another, didn't stay with George and his wife, but later on they did adopt Jean Charpiot, or Jean Ann Charpiot, a beautiful and intelligent girl. She has an annual award named after her called the Jean Charpiot Goodhart Award that was donated by Harry G. Goodhart III, her son, in honor of her love of a well-crafted fiction. You may remember the name Goodhart from our History Club on Broadway businesses. Luke Goodhart, the founder of the Goodhart Laundry on South Broadway, used to live on South Lincoln Street. It's now the
Or just turn it off.
Break.
This has been totally fascinating. Just saying. Brittany is good.
Very good. Yeah. Did we lose her?
I think she's had audio problems.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to say that picture from the newspaper is my mother.
Really?
And, yeah. So when she gets an opportunity to share back again, I'll show you. My mom's on the left. In the middle. My mom is the tall girl on the left, and this is Lolly, Aunt Laura. And then Tadia is a cousin visiting from Denmark. She came over in 1939 and spent quite a bit of time in Denver. And my mom and Jean Charpiot, so the little girl over here, she was a few years younger than my mom, escorted Aunt Tadia back to New York to catch her ship back to Denmark. And think about it, it was 1939. Wow. So very challenging time. And of course, thereafter, Denmark was overrun and, controlled by the Nazis during the course of the war. And then in the upper right corner is Jean and her husband, Harry Goodhart II. And Jean, just as an extra piece of information, was actually a family member. She was the child of a cousin, let's see, child of, I guess, a cousin of Laura's. So they took her in when her mom kind of disappeared and adopted and raised her as their own child.
That's amazing. Did you ever find out about the New Year's Eve party baby? Or had you ever heard any stories about that?
Story. I don't know anything about that, but I think my mother would have told me. They definitely didn't raise that child. That much I do know. So maybe somebody blamed them. Or,
the article was saying they were trying to find the parents, so maybe the mom or something changed their mind.
Right.
Awesome. Sorry about that disconnect. I think my phone thought I wasn't there anymore. Okay. Okay. So the last thing I was going to say about this slide is that George seemed really close with everyone from all sides of the family. I think he was kind of like a bridge, including Henry C. Charpiot, and he ended up visiting him and his wife in his home in San Francisco most often. But he seemed to be closest with Aunt Eugenie, judging by all the times that wherever Aunt Eugenie moved, George was right there with her.
Mm.
So in 1919, Eugenie was the only remaining sibling left, and she had survived all of her brothers by 12 years. The funeral of Eugenie Putz Underhill had a large service at Ollinger Chapel, and interment will be at Riverside Cemetery. The obituary states that she was one of the first white women to cross the plains and settle in the Denver area. She died at the home of her niece during her 84th year. Eugenie Putz was the pioneer milliner and costumer of Denver. Her brother, Frederick Charpiot, was one of the first restaurateurs in the city. And from 1861 to 1871, the millinery and dressmaking establishment of Mrs. Charpiot supplied the fashions to Denver society. Honorary pallbearers will be P.D. Gaylord, Jerome S. Reich, F.S. Byers, and pallbearers will be W. Logan Field and Casimir Barth. So just these names alone show as pallbearers and in the ceremony that she really was an honored lady, and so that was nice to see. Mm-hmm. She ended up dividing her last assets among her nieces and nephews, and she states, "I hereby declare that I am at the end of making this will and an unmarried woman, being the widow of Austin and M. Underhill, deceased, and that I have not now and never did have any children. Eugenie Jones, her adopted daughter, ended up gaining the most in the arrangement. I give and bequeath to my adopted daughter, Eugenie Charpiot Jones, to be her absolute property, the balance of any cash on hand, the residue of her personal estate, including wearing apparel." That's actually close, so I think that's funny, and 408 South Lincoln. But sadly, in 1919, Eugenie lost a lot of the clothes in a burglary by means of a pass key, and they made way with clothing value at $130. I'm just obsessed with finding out what happened to the thousands of beautiful costumes and dresses and stuff that she supplied all of Denver. And so seeing that there was a burglary after Eugenie Jones may have inherited, it's like, no, now they're gone forever. She gives her grandniece and nephew. Ethel gets 412 South Lincoln and Oliver gets 418 South Lincoln. She also gives 1/3 divided all of her remaining 317 lots in Swansea and asks them to be divided evenly between George J., Oliver, Ethel, and Herbert. She forgot to include Charles, her nephew in Kansas City, and so then she gives him $3,000 promissory note, which is about $47,000 a day. But what is sweet is that Luke Goodhart of the Goodhart laundry family, Jean Charpiot's husband, was a witness on her will. And so this shows how close the bond must have been with the family to have him sign this delicate document. And George continued in the safe business as well in later years, investing in other businesses, including the Beaver Valley Ranch and Livestock Company. And he was head of the Lakewood Golf Course and was mocked for how talented he was. No, really, he was actually talented. And from the sounds of it, he scored high in many tournaments. A golf club in New York even taunted him for his talent for mashies 100 yards off the green. They offered him 100,000 baked beans, half of which would be donated to a home for superannuated golfers if he would go to New York and illustrate his mashie talent. He even created the Charpiot trophy at the golf club as well in honor of himself and his talent. And he was very much a society man and became the worshipful master of the Masonic Oriental Lodge. He even helped create and facilitate the main Masonic temple called the Scottish Rite Cathedral here in Denver. He worked hard as part of the Masons to secure the Masonic silver trowel for the lodge, which was a big feather in his cap and put his small Masonic Oriental Lodge on the map. And George was also the founder of the El Jebel Band here in Denver, and later he was elected the illustrious Pontiff, and he had big success in the club, and the club offered opportunities to travel for members. On one occasion, he organized a special train to go up the West Coast to put on performances to see both the 1915 World Fair in San Francisco and the 1950 Panama, California exposition in San Diego. How incredible! What I wouldn't give to see the San Francisco World Fair. I just drool all over the photos every time I see them. And he was so loved that the club members one morning and their wives and babies of the band made a pilgrimage to George's home without letting Mr. and Mrs. Charpiot know beforehand, and a delightful musical concert was had in the front yard. So the friendship between the Sardou family and the Charpiots began in 1908 when Mrs. Horace W. Bennett, daughter of Jerome S. Riche, went to France and was entertained at the Victorian Sardou Chateau. The French playwright of both comedies and historical dramas was a master of stage technique. He wrote 70 plays, including Tosca, Fedora, and Cleopatra. He wrote several plays specifically for Sarah Bennett and 2 plays for Sir Henry Irving. So I actually had planted 7 Sarah Bernhardt peonies in my front yard last summer after finding this out in honor of them. I didn't know this at the time, but I wanted to plant it because it was the peony itself was created in 1906, and that was the year the house was built. So I just thought it was appropriate. But now there's a Charpiot connection. So again, the joke of, am I possessed by the Charpiots or not? So Victorian was a very eccentric character and an incredibly talented playwright, and his works have been adapted into numerous movies and plays even today. In 1857, Sardou felt the pangs of actual want, and his misfortunes culminated in an attack of typhoid fever. He was living in poverty and was dying in his garret, surrounded by his rejected manuscripts. And a lady who was living in the same house unexpectedly came to his assistance. Her name was Madame Bercourt, and she had theatrical connections that he needed. She nursed him, cured him, and when he was well again, introduced her to her friend, who had just established a theater. And fortune began to smile on him as an author, and from then on, it's history. And now many streets and sculptures have his name. He was also an incredible artist, and his etchings depicts houses purported to belong to Mozart on Jupiter, to Christ, or to the prophet Zoroaster, claiming to be guided by the spirit of Bernard Palissy, the main character in his play of the same name. He described his experience as a medium in the Revue Spirit in 1858, explaining that he also communicated with his grandfather, then residing on Jupiter, and his 2 sisters who had died in infancy, who now live on Juno. These ethereal Rococo edifices show Sardou's astonishing skill as an engraver. The spiritus period came to an end when his plays were performed once more and his fortunes rose. He also helped design all of his stages and his costumes. So another a side note about Chateau de Marly, which was the home of Victorian Sardou. This was situated in the palace complex of the Garden of Versailles and was built by Louis XIV. The theme of Marly was that it was a simple hunting lodge, just enough to accommodate the royal hunt. The Sun King attended the opening of the completed hydraulic works in June 1684, which pumped water from Chateau de Marly to the Versailles Garden. Abandoned by Louis XV and Louis XVI, the castle and its park were gradually deteriorating, and the last royal stay took place in 1789. Napoleon briefly took over the property, but it was destroyed during the resistance. A French factory was later built on it, destroying the main chateau. In 1863, a wanderer mounted on a donkey that bore him through the woods at will suddenly had his steed halted at the edge of the broad hollow covered with an abundance of tasty thistles. Our wanderer, enchanted by the spot's cool air and solitude, urged his mount through the lofty trees and that edged the far side of the ditch, eager to discover what their dense foliage would reveal. This wanderer was none other than dramatist Victorien Sardou. He was captivated by the place, ardently longing to own it. He achieved his goal in 1863, and he altered the appearance of the property, filling it with his collections and the gifts bestowed on him by his admirers. A celebrated playwright, he surrounded himself with a circle of performers and artists who flattered him and enthusiastically attended the lavish receptions he hosted in his residence in Marly. Victorien Sardou also became involved with the daily life of the commune of Marly and became the mayor. When he died in 1908, the usufruct of the property was granted to his wife, while the bare ownership went to his 4 children. And today, the horse trough is surrounded by this beautiful little town. The Alley of the Sphinx is still there for all to enjoy, but the bust of Victorien Sardou is missing. And the Cour Marly in the Louvre Museum was inaugurated in 1993, and it contains mostly works of art from Marly displayed on 3 levels. Okay, so why was this important? Because in 1920, at the age of 29, Julie Charpiot, daughter of Henry Charles Charpiot, became engaged to the youngest son of Victorien Sardou, the famous French dramatist. And André Sardou was a leader of society in Nice, France, and the engagement, as said, has caused a sensation throughout the French literary circles. André had picked up some of the works that his father had left and successfully put on these shows. But after that, not much is known of him. And this is where it gets crazy, because as I'm searching for André Sardou and his fathers, most of the time they don't list André as his son. Like here, just even on this Google search, it doesn't mention them at all. However, in the marriage records of Julie and André, it says that they were living at Moulay-le-Roi, the chateau, and is the youngest son of Victorien Sardou, deceased. And Julie and André seem to live at the Castle Marly for a little bit of time, and the Princess of Denver got a sense of what it's like living in royalty in the castle. And here's a famous painting of Victorien Sardou and his family at Marly-le-Roi, shown here. And this is the only picture I found to feature his youngest son, and he would have been the baby in the photo. A year later, the last of the Denver Charpiot pioneers died. Julie's grandma, Julia Riche, died in Bruges at the age of 87 years old. She had lived in Bruges through the thick of the war, and it's believed that the turmoil wore heavily on the Charpiot and probably hastened her end. Refugees from Alsace poured into the town on Bruges, where the hospital was conducted, and the horror of the war is believed to have preyed upon her mind. Mrs. Charpiot's husband died in May 1907. Her 2 children, Henry and Adeline, the latter is now Mrs. Henry Bernegard, the wife of a wealthy Parisian merchant, were at her bedside when she died Tuesday. And even in these articles in 1921, they had to remind readers of who Julia Riche was and why she was important, although hundreds of newspaper articles fawned over her just 2 decades before. The articles reminisce about the once famous Delmonico's, but even at this point, very few remembered the glorious past of that establishment, nor was the building really recognizable as that. This photo here is from their going away party in 1904. She's at the end here. And we don't hear much at all about Julia after her marriage. In 1923, her sister-in-law was a marchioness, which is a widow of a marquess. A marquess is a European title of nobility ranking in modern times immediately below a duke or a count or an earl. The family loved their actors and theatrical members, and the marchioness, Julie's sister-in-law, married the playwright of the Marquis de Fleur, and he owned a French newspaper. In 1928, Julie and André built the Villa Beausoleil, seen here, and it was on the Rue de Brussels and La Canette, which is a region that used to be part of Caen. The construction photo was taken in 1928 as a tour of the construction of the facade, and her brother-in-law, Pierre Sardou, was an architect for the French government, so maybe he helped build their house. That'd be cool. You can see the photo here of her in her garden with a house in the background, and you can actually still see the house today. So this house is still this one. A small little plaque also recalls the home's name that's still there. She herself became a widow in 1931 after only 11 years of marriage. And we learned the death of Mr. André Sardou, who died in La Canette, Alpes Maritime, on May 8th after a painful illness. The deceased, aged 49. And during World War II, all of the French Sardou family, including Villa Beausoleil, had their assets frozen by the U.S. government. The property belonging to enemy nations was continuously confiscated until hostilities ceased. Some of the confiscated enemy property would not be returned later, but agreements to return some or most assets in exchange for seized American assets and reparations for war damage American interests by the government of the former enemy nations were later concluded. Nations or organizations that were deemed less responsible for starting the wars received much more favorable treatment. And looking at the records, all of their homes, as well as even the plays that the family held the rights to at Victorian Sardo, were held by the government, which is described as the vesting order relating to the opera La Tosca and the literary production Madame Sangrain. And the reason for this was due to the sometimes forgotten invasion of southern France called Operation Dragoon.
Mm-hmm.
Cannes was preparing to hold its first film festival, created in response to the award given under German influence to Lene Riefenstahl's 1938 film Olympia at the Venice International Film Festival. France and the US decided to create this new festival under the presidency of Louis Lumière, but it was canceled because of the war. The border territories were directly impacted, and on June 1940, Mussolini declared war on France. He wanted to conquer Nice and its region and reach Marseille. On August 1940, the Transalpine government issued a decree dating July 30th regarding the status of occupied territories. The territories thus annexed by Italy were subject to Transalpine obligations, and Italian became the official language and the lira the official currency, while foreign postage rates applied to correspondence with France and Italian public services replaced those of France, which complicated administrative and commercial relationships. In mid-1940, the French army withdrew a line between Caen and Grasse, abandoning the eastern Alpine pike. So this would be, Grasse is to the north, Caen was to the south, and Le Canet is directly in the middle there. And in 1941, nearly 2,500 Jews arrived in Italy, and in September 1943, the first roundup took place in Caen and Saint-Martin-Vesubie in particular. The Italian occupants were not particularly inclined to persecute Jews in the department, and local people did their best to protect them, but in all, 3,612 Jews were deported. And the first traces of the resistance were discovered in Grasse, which is the town next door to where Julia lived in Le Canet. But it was not really structured until 1943, when Mussolini was overthrown and the first German units entered the Alps Maritime. And after August 1944, the port of Caen was partially destroyed, and the Germans occupied the Alps Maritime until August 1944. The great resistance leader Jean Moulin, hiding his clandestine activities under his passion for painting, opened an art gallery in Nice in 1943. And the French resistance against the Nazi German occupation and the Vichy French puppet government increased drastically in the weeks leading up to the Dragon landings. To fight the uprising, German units committed numerous atrocities and war crimes against German fighters as well as civilians in retaliatory acts. Atrocities continued during the German retreat from southern France as German soldiers plundered and burned down towns. The 2nd SS Panzer Division hung 99 civilians while moving towards northern France during the Toul massacre, and the next day they murdered 642 civilians and then proceeded to plunder and burn the town. French civilians were brought before military courts and sentenced to death because of alleged partisan activities. These atrocities did not help but to subdue the French uprising. Instead, the German reprisals had the opposite effect and encouraged the French population to engage in partisan fighting. So Julie's cousin, the children of her Aunt Adeline's husband, Jean Bernegard, was in fact part of this French resistance, and he was part of the French forces of the interior. It's unclear whether he was hung by the Germans for his role like the others, because no date is listed for his death. But I'd like to think that Julia, who seemed like she was a joyful and very strong spirit herself, would secretly have been a part of this resistance from her little place in between this battle. I'm speculating here, but she really would have seen a lot of battles during this war from her villa, and it's unclear if she fled, perhaps to Paris with her in-laws, or to Branche, or to San Francisco with her father, or if she stayed. Either way, after the war, the family received their properties back and some reparations on December 26, 1949. And so during all of this war, Julie's cousin, Herbert, was captain of the Navy. Commander Herbert A. Jones of the United States Navy was promoted to the rank of captain effective in 9 months. Commander Jones attended West High School and graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1907. He is now instructor-inspector of the Southern California Naval Reserve. He is the author of a moving picture about the Navy, which appeared in Denver Theater. The man who keeps the gobs of Uncle Sam's Navy happy with prize fights, talkies, books, and other types of recreation stopped in Denver Thursday on his way from Washington to the coast to visit his mother, brother, and other relatives who live here. He is Commander Herbert A. Jones, Morale Officer of the Navy, scion of a pioneer Denver family, and a classmate at the United States Naval Academy. Commander Jones's officer recently created the largest motion picture equipment contract in the history of the movie industry, he revealed, when $875,000 in talking picture projectors were ordered to equip 20 battleships, 60 cruisers, 120 destroyers, all shore stations, all Army transports, and many Coast Guard vessels with apparatus to display the newest products of Hollywood. In addition, contracts totaling $100,000 annually were placed with picture producers. So the Navy has Mr. Jones to thank for their movie entertainment. And Herbert had 2 children, and can you guess their names? His son was named after him. It was Herbert Charpiot Jones, and his daughter was named after his wife and his sister's name, which was Ethelyn Sargent Jones. So keeping with tradition. And Herbert Charpiot Jones was the son of Herbert Aloysius, and he was born on January 21st, 1918 at Los Angeles, California, and enlisted in the United States Naval Reserve May 14, 1935. He was commissioned as ensign in November 14, 1940, and reported to the battleship USS California at Pearl Harbor 2 weeks later. Herb, as he was known by his families and friends, was a fun-loving California native who spent summer with friends sunning by the pool at the Hotel Del, but the kind of man who was always prepared to fight for his country and following in his father's footsteps. As a young officer, Ensign Jones understood the events unfolding around the world at the time, and like so many others, proposed to his college sweetheart, Joanne, well aware of the possibility of the United States entering into World War II. Jones arrived in Hawaii in early 1941 and was joined shortly by his fiancée, Joanne. They married in June, and Joanne lived in Honolulu. His ship, the USS California, had been in peacetime conditions with little ammunition available topside, meaning any additional ammunition had to be brought up from the magazines below. On December 7, 1941, the 23-year-old ensign was about to relieve the officers on deck of the USS California when Japanese planes swooped in to the attack. In the first wave, a torpedo and a bomb hit the ship. Jones dove into the smoke-filled hatchway and crawled along oil-slick decks to rescue a stricken sailor before being temporarily overcome by fumes. Reviving, he saw an anti-aircraft battery without a leader and staggering to his feet took command. As a second wave of Japanese planes came in, the young officer fired his guns until all their ammunition was expended. Since the torpedo had put California's ammunition hoist out of action, Jones quickly organized a party of volunteers to go down and pass the ammunition up by hand. Each shell weighed 50 pounds. The group worked tirelessly to keep the guns supplied, passing ammunition by hand until the bomb blast rocked California around 8:45 a.m. Jones was fatally wounded in the blast. 2 sailors attempted to evacuate him from the compartment, which is beginning to go up in flames, but Jones refused, worried more for their lives than his own. His final words were spoken as, "Leave me alone, I am done for. Get out of here before the magazines go off." And Ensign Jones was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for conspicuous devotion to duty, extraordinary courage, and complete disregard for his own life, above and beyond the call of duty during the attack on the fleet at Pearl Harbor by Japanese forces on December 7, 1941. And in 1942, a ship was built and named in his honor. It was called the USS Herbert C. Jones, and the ship was one of 2 DEs equipped to detect and jam German Glide Fritz X bombs. Herbert's widow, Joanne, launched and christened the boat on January 19, 1943. And there's even a YouTube video that you can watch honoring him. And this picture here is them christening the boat and putting it in. What I think is kind of interesting is there was a whole comic book that, displayed his last moments, which is kind of crazy. So the last cousin was Ethel Eugenie Jones, and she was the baby of the family and the youngest daughter of Eugenie. And she was 9 years younger than her middle brother, And I bet she was spoiled by the family a bit. Aunt Eugenie Jones, and Ethel were all living together in 1916 at 408 South Lincoln. They had advertised that they were renting out the front room, and it had beautiful light and a formal foyer. A gentleman named Charles R. Wise moved into the front room. He was the secretary and treasurer of the dental specialty company. And while he was living there, Ethel and Charles fell in love. And with those three women living there, I bet there was a little bit of matchmaking going on. And a pretty little wedding was solemnized at the home of Mrs. Eugenie Charpiot Jones yesterday, 408 South Lincoln, at high noon, when Miss Ethel Jones became the bride of Charles Wise. The Reverend Father Donnelly of St. Francis de Sales Church read the ceremony, after which a breakfast was served to 25 guests. The house was decorated with yellow chrysanthemums and palms. The bride wore a suit of velour delaine trimmed with black frocks. She carried an arm bouquet of Ophelia roses. The only attendant was Oliver Jones, the brother of the bride, who gave her in marriage. I just thought this was so beautiful. What a sweet little ceremony and beautiful love story that happened in this house. Charles was 17 years older than Ethel, and during the Great Depression in 1934, they divorced, and Ethel never did end up having any children, but she was able to hold on to the house at 412 South Lincoln that she inherited, and that rent helped provide for her in her later years. She remarried in 1940 to someone who was her age, which is Grant Allen Wilson, and they remained married until he died in 1962. And Ethel died in 1975 and was the last survivor who was close to Aunt Eugenie. So each year, the pioneers of the city would gather for the annual banquets. In 1884, they sponsored a trip to the National Mining Exposition, where they held all their banquets. It says, the barnacles are assembling in the city from village and city and farms and mines all over the state. 17 or 18 years ago, one who was well acquainted with the territory knew nearly every face that they saw. Today, more of those familiar countenances can be seen on the street than have been assembled in Denver since the first or second territorial fairs. The present reunion has brought together more of the old-timers than either of those have been preceded in the 12 years of existence. The pioneer class seems to be a substantial, solid citizen. It is the evening of life with nearly all of them. The gray hairs are the rule instead of the exception. Many of them have grown wealthy, and very, very few of them are very poor. The energy and enterprise that made them pioneers has given them homes and moderate competencies at least. But better than fortune and homes, they are good citizens. There are no drunkards or dishonorable citizens in the list. And it's interesting to look over the list and see how many wealthy have grown from the smallest beginnings. It would be a story of men, every one of whom have won success by labor. And so today, they celebrate as they long have the right to celebrate. One old pioneer was heard to say last evening, take away these buildings and separate the tenderfeet from the barnacles, and it looks just like the good old 59. The lady pioneers, some of who are pretty well rent by the weight of years, but their keen womanly sense of the beautiful mingled with the grand is still fresh as their more youthful sisters. And so by 1904, the banquets look like this. The Colorado Pioneers held their annual reunion last night. No one was present but pioneers and some of the children. The reunion was held at the Chamber of Commerce, was marked by an elaborate ball and banquet. This gathering together the old-timers, settlers of Colorado, is always a happy time for older folk. There are no outsiders, but their troublesome desire to hear stories that they don't know nothing about. When a real pioneer tells an old-time story, he likes it best to have heard or laughed or wept over by some other pioneer who was there and knows all about it. That's the real reason why the annual reunions of the pioneers are for the pioneers themselves. The opening speech was made. 22 members of society have passed away since the last reunion. The pleasure of the evening was dimmed for some little time among those who were here a year ago but are not present this year, and who were some of the best known members of society. And by 1921, the banquets included a great number of the children of the pioneers who laughed and shared the joy of dancing and old-time jigs just as their parents did. The barnacles faded away and the tenderfeet were left. And what's sad to me, though, is that there are so many pieces of history and stories talked about within these meetings, but it was closed to reporters, and the stories were often seen as only to be heard by the privileged barnacles and weren't for the tenderfeet because they wouldn't understand their humor. But I wish some of it would be recorded. So by the 1950s, most of the family had passed away. In 1939, Henry Charles was in New York on a business trip and was stricken by a heart attack and had to be sent home to San Francisco on a stretcher, where he died with his family. Adeline and Julie were lost to time, and there's no trace of them so far about how their story ended. Eugenie Jones died in Denver in 1940 at 80 years old and kept the house at 408 South Lincoln until shortly before she died. Ethel, George, and Julie never did have children of their own. They married older husbands, and it didn't work out for them that way. Herbert's 2 children have all passed away, and no grandchildren were created. George's adopted daughter also passed away, but the descendants who are still alive have helped me with some of the research today. And Henry Charles from San Francisco died in 1958 when the children were young, and some descendants may still be alive, but the memory of their grandparents hopefully are still a vibrant memory. So let's recap. In 1853, the family left their home of Bart, France, and sailed to New York, settled in Chicago, and started a French hotel. They were part of the French communities of Iowa and made their way to Denver in 1860. They made their fortunes, built a life, and in the later part of the 18th century, many of the younger generations migrated to the coast and settled in San Diego and San Francisco. A few migrated back to France, and Henry Charles became the bridge that spanned all of the family's history, where even he wound back in Chicago from time to time to take care of that little hotel that he and his wife ran, and close the loop on how the Charpiots migrated to America. And they certainly did find wealth, love, and created their own incredible stories. This incredible family was almost forgotten to history, with their stories fading with each generation. I feel lucky and fortunate to have discovered who they are and to have pieced together their lives. It has been the most rewarding year of my life, and I'm relieved that the stories have come alive once again and can be passed on to future generations. And let's take a moment and see their accomplishments and what we've lost to time. So this is Eugenie's shop, and this is what that street looks like today. This is another location of where her shop would have been, but obviously this is a new building. This is where the Charpiot Safe Company would have been. Now it's, I don't even know what this is, it's boarded up. This would have been the home of Henry C. Charpiot, but now it's the Goddard School. This is where the Charpiot Hotel, the Monaco's of the West, would have been, but now it's Ryder Square. This is what the home of where Frederick Charpiot would have lived, so it was this mansard roof here. This is where the hotel, that Henry Charles and Edith had, would have been. This is Jacques' home. You can still kind of see the little apple cellar he described here. This is Eugenie and Oliver Jones' first home. And this is the Jerome Riche. And I didn't get into the Riche family. That's a whole separate thing that's like super fascinating. But just take a look at this plot of land. There were 5 houses here and a stable. And this is the only one that's left today. And it's called the Marijuana Mansion. But this house in this huge lot is where Jerome would have lived. But all these are demolished. This is what it looks like today. And then this is the house of Charles Charpiot, totally gone. And then I didn't get into this either, but Jerome Riche's daughter ended up marrying one of the Crockers, and the Crockers are what they call in San Francisco the Big Four. And this is just some of the buildings. And I thought that it's funny because I used to be kind of a historian of San Francisco and get everybody to tour, and I would tell all these people about this spite fence that Charles Crocker, the dad, built. And turns out, you know, it's part of the Charpiot family, the cousins. So the cousin of Herbert and Henry Charles Jr. Would have been married to this very illustrious family. Thank you.